Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the War Report where based Putin is going to save white Western civilization. And okay, look, this man has never done anything wrong. There are no legitimate criticisms of him. Anyone who implies such a thing is simply just lying. And of course, we all know that, again, Putin is completely infallible, perfect politician, never done anything wrong. He's going to save Russia, he's going to save Ukraine, he's going to save the West, and we're all going to live under whatever. Now, of course, I am taking a little bit of shots at both sides here as the big brain centrist that I am, about the people who do have this overly optimistic view of Russia. Admittedly, they do exist, but what I've noticed much more common is people who think that there are droves of these people of this overly optimistic view of Russia and will spend a lot of time trying to dedicate why Putin hasn't done X, Y, or Z or some internal problem in Russia that may or may not even be related to Putin. But again, with all that out of the way, I just felt like I had to open with some pot shots all around. So now,
Yeah, I mean, I
now we
mean,
go ahead, go ahead.
it's created content for them for like 2 weeks. Uh, like they literally read comment sections, probably in YouTube or Twitter, and then they freak out and feel like, oh my God, we have to do something. We have to marshal this energy away from praising Russia or Putin. Like this is so retarded. I don't see, how many people you and I follow. I mean, we follow everybody, right? Even even people that people think we don't follow, we follow.
I
And
follow
so
most
we
of you listening to the show.
right, right. And I don't where are these videos? This is strictly like based off the comment sections. And I said this 2 weeks ago. That is, as things progress along the way they are progressing, people will start to feel more and more insecure as it looks like Russia is not doomed and that the West is on a gradual decline. And the more that happens, the more there's going to be like freaking out, even in the right. Well, nobody's making any videos I've seen where like who is this phantom right wing that is making content about how Putin is going to save the white race? They're just
It's me.
it
It's
doesn't
all me.
exist.
Okay, I admit it. I come clean. I'm the man you've been looking for all this time. I'm on the payroll of Dugin. I'm on the payroll of Putin. I'm on the payroll of whoever you think I'm on the payroll of. Because you know what? This is just how it works. Okay, I've been operating this massive system. I am next to technologically illiterate, but I do have a working knowledge of how to run all these bots. And I have created an entire sphere of the right wing that's been very influential for not just the past 15, but the past 20 years, believe me. Since 9/11, I have controlled American right-wing politics, and don't you forget it, okay? Now you may be saying, were you even old enough back then? Well, you know what? That's none of your concern. My personal, uh, my personal ongoings and age that may make something like that impossible, or even the technology available at the time that may make something like that impossible. That is none of your concern. But we are getting a bit off track on what the show is actually
Yeah.
about. So the probably the biggest thing short of a full-scale war has happened in the Ukrainian crisis, and that is the Russian Federation. It started within the Duma, worked its way up to the Kremlin, to Putin himself, has moved to recognize the breakaway republics of the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic, or Lugansk People's Republic. I know that's a very touchy linguistic thing when it comes to the G and the H sound between Russians and Ukrainians. It has caused many internal disputes. You could argue,
Literally bloodshed.
yeah, you could argue that is the root of this war, and I don't think that would be too far fetched. And I mean, those of you who know the power of linguistics and the power of language, I'm not going to claim to be some expert in that, but things as minor as that have caused bloodshed before, and we're actually looking at an example of it right now. But that's aside the point, at least insofar as this is concerned. The Russian Federation has given them official recognition, and Russian assets have begun to move into areas under the control of what were once separatist, or I suppose you could now consider forces of these independent republics, depending on how you really want to define it. I mean, insofar as it's concerned, I suppose this might be an unpopular take, but if you govern territory, you are the authority there, and if you're de facto independent, again, you're independent. And I'll even say that about, say, countries I don't like, such as Kosovo or Israel. You know my opinions on those, but that doesn't change the fact that they're still actors that are able to operate with some degree of laterality. Now, of course, they all have their, especially Kosovo, have their certain limits they can go to because of the reality of the situation. But for the past 8 years, at least, these chunks of the Donbass have been governed independently or as a proxy of Russia, depending on how you'd like to define it and depending on how you who you ask or whatever else. But this has sparked the reaction again that's just shy of war. The big sanctions package that Biden and the West had coming down the pipe was Germany, number one, temporarily suspended, but not permanently suspended, cooperation on Nord Stream 2, which means it's going to be a cold one for them. We'll get back to that one because there's a lot more to talk about with that. The other one was barring members of the Russian legislature and Russian government from, again, barring them their diplomatic status. Now, I don't see how much of a blow that is, and of course, there's always the speculation, well, what if Putin takes the Russian oligarchs' yachts and their assets and their properties, not realizing that most of these Russian oligarchs, and I'm not saying all of them who have assets in the West, but most of them who have their predominant assets in the West, again, are the people who got kicked out 20 years ago. You know, the, what's his name? No, Kolomoisky's the Ukrainian one. Again, that one that runs the one,
Ko-
the one.
Korhadovsky.
Yes, that was him. He runs that institute talking about freedom, democracy to Russia. Again, all of Yeltsin boys, all of them. It's like these are the main ones driving a lot of this anti-Russia push. And with that, there are some things they could do to put a little bit of pain on Russian oligarchs and the Russian elites' assets in the West, but I don't think it would be anything that would lead to the collapse of the Russian state. When they didn't go full bore with sanctions in 2014, they lost a lot of opportunity because they left Russia some room to adapt. Now, if they would have gone to the fullest extent of sanctions all at once, that would have been a gamble, but that may have possibly brought Russia to the table because it would have deprived them of everything at once. Instead, they took this very gradual approach where it's like, we'll take away a
I don't know
little
how
bit.
gradual it was,
Uh,
to be honest.
I mean, but the, it was over, like, again, 2014,
They
2015,
were
where,
just there are some sanctions that they have in place that, yes, they're there to hurt more people, individuals within the Russian state, who are, players in all this. But in terms of like technology, cutting out the banks, like a lot of this was already done in 2014 and 15. Now they're doing some stuff on debt, but Russia's been already moving in that direction. You're right. Maybe that one could have been one that they could have done, but
I mean,
the
but
reason
just
the reason that the U.S. had to be careful, because that's who's instigating this, is because they could also not hurt Europe, and ultimately that's what this is about. Is not so much Ukraine, but is Russia's connection to Europe.
yes, and I was actually about to bring that up, like, in terms of this, how much heat will Europe take on behalf of the American empire? But I suppose that was the risk that had to be calculated in 2014, 2015. Do we go full bore with this and risk isolating Europe, or do we take this at a ever so slightly, not slow, but ever so slightly slower pace and keep Europe afloat, keep Europe stable, even though it seems like that one has backfired and perhaps the other one would have backfired. Perhaps this was just a no-win situation as soon as they put their foot into the Ukraine, which I believe is pretty reasonable considering just its proximity to Russia. Not saying that Ukraine has been a breeze for Russia, but they have been playing on their home turf more or less. And with that being said, we're seeing the next step of that. We saw, of course, in 2014, Crimea was taken flawlessly. There was up to 9,000 defectors who joined the Russian forces upon their ascension. There is speculation of cells of Russian sympathizers and potential defectors all over the Ukrainian military, and this is after the restructuring of the Ukrainian military, after their, let's just say, less than stellar performance in the early months of the conflict in 2014, where a lot of the fighting was outsourced to militias, and of course, one of the most infamous being ones such as the Azov Battalion and their ilk. But with that being said, even with the restructuring and the reorganization, you still do have quite a few elements that are sympathetic to Russia. And as I've stated previously, but I'll just put this concisely, it seems like, at least insofar as the West is concerned, with Biden's moves, taking this very aggressive line, but also saying we won't do anything to enforce it, more trying to bait Russia into a conflict, the death by a thousand cuts, as we discussed last episode, the bear trap, if you will. They are banking on Ukrainians fighting like Afghans when they are infinitely more likely to pack up and just walk home like the Iraqis did upon the 2003 invasion. Which is why I would speculate in the case of a massive war. I do believe that there would be very few Ukrainians with the wherewithal or even concern to fight. A lot of them probably would go home. Not out of any great sympathy to Russia, but in terms of Ukraine isn't necessarily worth dying for. Now, you'll have those elements in every country, but it doesn't seem like the willingness to fight and shed blood for Ukraine is really within its people beyond a few subsets of nationalists who are usually of a more Western Ukrainian persuasion. And even then, you get that weird inverse where you get some of those, I guess you could call them pan-Slavic nationalists out of some parts of Western Ukraine. It's a very spotty situation all around, and trying to peg down loyalties based on region can be done in general, but it can only be done so far before you run things, because there are some groups in central and eastern Ukraine who do identify as Ukrainian, who do primarily speak Ukrainian, and actually have a, one could say, greater grudge towards Russia because of the proximity. So, again, there's just, those are small factors to consider, nothing that would change your outview or our complete analysis of this, but the reaction to this across the Western media, across the world, has been quite interesting. Probably the funniest thing I saw is that Syria almost immediately recognized the two republics, saying that once we're done with our civil war, we'll send troops to support you again. It was just like, I mean, there's this concept of this meme warfare that goes around. You can see this all the time with the way official diplomatic Twitter accounts just interact with each other. It's just this, again, war of words. This who can have the wittiest response. The it's applying the lens of social media to diplomacy, which in some cases is a very good thing, some cases is a very bad thing, but nonetheless is always interesting. You had Syria come out and recognize that. As far as I know, you haven't had any other country so far recognize it, not even say a Belarus or even China, but I imagine that will change in the next few days, and the pattern it will probably follow is the countries that recognize Crimea's annexation will recognize uh, Donbass and Luhansk, assuming they aren't just wiped off the map tomorrow, which I'm not saying would happen, but there's the ever so slight possibility that Ukraine has some miracle victory and suppresses any internal rebellion, as it were. I'm not banking on that, but I'll just
Right.
put that out there. And I suppose this goes back to the root of the conflict, which I did tease a bit earlier. Nord Stream 2 has been temporarily suspended. Now, you also had that. You had Blinken canceling his meeting with Lavrov, and the usual things you see in light of these diplomatic breakdowns. Now, with that, the real question comes into focus, which I teased previously. How much pain is Germany, is Europe willing to tolerate in order to remain in the good graces of the American Empire to knock Russia down a peg? And there was some figure about, I think, German energy reserves are pretty low. I can't remember the exact figure. I think it was something at, what, 30% of what it used to be ever since the shutdown of the nuclear plants. And I don't know, will this lead to a revival in the nuclear plants? I don't see that. I don't think that they would just reverse course like that. Maybe they'll become more reliant on, say, France, which does export its energy from its nuclear program, and or maybe they'll import more LNG from the United States, as Biden refused to issue or renew any drilling permits on federal land, which is part of the reason that the energy prices have spiked so much. And one prediction I can make to most of our American audience, in fact, our world audience, is just that energy prices will continue to rise. And of course, with how globalized trade is, and even just on a national level, just from interstate shipping within, say, the U.S. or and that's on top of things like trucker protests now being an idea in the public consciousness. Maybe it won't even be a protest on our side. Maybe it will be some shitlib protest in order to get whatever implemented. But the public consciousness of truckers or teamsters just refusing to uh, transport products, you can only expect inflation to continue, the price of everything to continue to rise. And I think that will be the most immediate consequences on this. It will probably be heavier in Europe than it will within the States or Canada or the rest of the Anglosphere. And I suppose the true nature of this conflict has been exposed. Now, that's not to say the future of Ukraine was never a primary concern. This conflict admittedly was, especially for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. But insofar as the American empire and her apparatuses, such as the State Department, the CIA, whatever, the Victoria Newlands of the world, it's always been about hegemony over Europe now, hasn't it? It's always been about
Hmm. Yeah.
keeping Germany down and Russia out. That original mission statement of NATO. It's always been about, and as we discussed last episode, it's not necessarily that Europe is vital to American strategic interests or the American empire's strategic interests, I should say, but it's vital depriving Europe from Russia and or China, or even an independent future.
Right. I mean, in many ways, America took over when it took over the British Empire. Uh, it took over this problem or this concern as well to make sure that Russia and Germany are never united. And this was back when really China was not very consequential at all. Um, the situation now is far, far different because China is absolutely extremely vital and important. And, you know, for Europe to re-stimulate its economy, cheap gas is paramount. And there would be more prosperity if Germany had more of a free hand, but that would mean whittling away at the American empire especially financially and economically, and of course it would also isolate Britain, mainly because Britain in its its own decision has placed it where it is. So um, it's kind of like a perennial concern, right, of the Anglo world that uh, Russia and Germany can never be united. Now, of course, it's also a concern of Poland and some of these other little countries and that's where historically Britain always found support, was to keep these two great powers separated. Because that would mean that they themselves would have to be more subservient or pliable to various German and Russian influences and demands. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is that to get back just to the sanctions, was the first order of sanctions. They didn't come. There was no Nord Stream 2, right? So Nord Stream 1 had been completed, and Merkel had not even suggested a Nord Stream 2 yet. And I think it was near the end of 2015 that she came to Putin with a proposal for Nord Stream 2. Um, and that was after I think the second package. There were all kinds of there were constant sanctions being levied, but there were, excuse me, they were two big packages, one in 2014 and 15. And I'm pretty sure that her proposal came, I could be wrong, maybe the chat knows, but I tend to think her proposal came after the second package, which came in 2015. And that, that I think changed things up. I think that was whatever, like, I think, the Americans, what they were afraid of was that Ukraine was going to be part of the Eurasian economic agreement. And they thought, if we don't get a coup happening right now, um, it's going to be really hard to ever tear them apart. And this would be a kind of a, for the American perspective, it would be kind of like a runway for the Chinese influence into Europe. You know, influence, well, I mean, it's not so much influence like over their culture. America determines that. It's influence like economic influence, right? Which would basically amount to like, you know, you're going to shit talk us. We will ask you to reduce shit talking by 20% and so on. And so for Russia, of course, that option would never be there, no matter what. So the anyhow, so I think Nord Stream 2 absolutely changed things. I think the original course was to try to get a coup to stop Ukraine from joining the Eurasian Economic Agreement. That was a proposal. In many ways, Ukraine should never have been forced into that position. I remember those days. I already knew in 2013 that you could not enter an agreement with the EU or NATO unless you agreed to all the paused requirements that they were going to impose on you. Your culture would have to be changed. As I've said before, you would literally have to become, even on a cultural level, an immigrant in your own country, because liberalism is, it's universal, but it also has a futurist element. The main takeaway is that it has a disregard for history, and whatever history it keeps is kind of um, like a hollow version of itself, in the same way that liberalism keeps the monarchy going, but the monarchy is irrelevant.
Yes,
Um,
history exists for to justify a narrative, and that comes in either two forms. Just to use some based examples, is I'd say form number one is slavery. You must feel guilty for that, and we must work to atone for that. Or World War II, we have to prevent. It's our sacred duty to prevent another German mustache man from ever coming to power. Which now, of course, they're trying to put that image onto Putin, comparing Donbass to the various regions that Hitler or I'm sorry,
yes.
German mustache man. Excuse me, YouTube censors. Uh, Reabsorbed into Germany. And speaking of Putler, I suppose we should delve into a little bit of his speech.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead. I heard most of it.
So, upon his recognition of these two republics, he went over a what could only be described as a brief history of Ukraine from a Russian perspective. Now, he went over that. Of course, it was that historical Russian land, and focused mainly on the past century, saying that modern Ukraine, as we know it, their language, their borders, their culture, a lot of that is a product of Soviet government policy, of the Soviet Union, of Lenin, of Stalin, of the Bolsheviks, trying to drive a wedge in what he roughly called the historic Russian nation, which encompasses modern day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, viewing them as one people, which is a narrative that seems like at least people within Putin's spheres have been pushing, but he hasn't really pushed himself beyond a few times except right now. And he went after the Ukrainians in particular for their decommunization policy, tearing down monuments to Lenin, changing street names of communist officials, saying, and more or less said, well, those are the men who created your country. If you want decommunization, we'll show you what it looks like. And again, a veiled threat, probably, again, very, very abstract to restore Russian imperial borders is how the talking heads in the Western media would take it, but he's really promoting this narrative, which I would say, just from an outsider looking in, now of course I have my biases, is mostly true that a lot of these identities created by the Soviet Union were artificial. You can only really trace Ukrainian nationalism in any real form back to the 19th century. And there's all kinds of mental gymnastics that Ukrainians used to occupy all the way into, all the way to the Don River into Rostov along the modern day Russian Ukrainian border. Just these very weird meta historical takes, if you will. And Putin outright said that, look, we are one nation. Russians, Ukrainians were one and the same. We're brotherly people, if not same people. And he's also said, once again, similar things about Belarus. And really just tore into it and came just shy of calling Ukraine an artificial entity. Now, he did, in his words, he did in the course of the speech, but he never outright named it. And perhaps that's a lost art in the West, the art of subtlety, the art of making your words do the work for you, of saying things without having to explain them like you're talking to a 10-year-old. And I don't know, maybe it's just that we're starved from that in the West, but overall, especially if you're a Russian who has any ounce of stock left in the future of his or her nation, I would say it was a pretty good speech. A lot of Western analysts are, of course, quick to call this unhinged, call it crazy, try to paint Putin as some, a senile old despot. I wonder who that might actually sound like. Certainly nobody that we know. But again, just this very raw realpolitik, if you will, about Russia's interests, who the Russian people are, and what we're going to do to further those interests into the future. And say even if you do have more pro-Ukraine sympathies or whatever, I don't see how anyone, unless you're being overtly disingenuous or have completely drunk the liberal Kool-Aid to the point where it has taken over your bloodstream, can see this as anything other than like this is a leader of Russia expressing what Russia wants going into the future. And overall, again, just the idea of a leader of a nation giving a speech asserting national identity is so lost on Westerners, even right-wing Westerners who would love to hear something like that, that it does come off, at least subconsciously to a lot of people, as an unhinged thing that they would do it. Now, of course, again, the German mustache man comparisons, which have been there for years, the Putler memes have come out in full force, of course. Well, this is how, in the 1930s, Germany justified its expansion to blah, blah, blah. And, one thing I will say is, you don't, regardless of whatever evils were committed by the National Socialist government, virtually any party that would have come to power in Germany and the German people recognized the situation post World War I, again, this is a bit of a tangent, as millions of Germans have been left outside the borders of the German state in this world order created post Versailles that's supposed to guarantee this nationalism for all nations is the thing that was purported. And you have, again, millions of Germans stuck under foreign rule, whether that be Czechs, Poles, etc. So, again, regardless of what would come to pass throughout the late 30s and the 1940s, it isn't that absurd of a notion that Germans as a people, regardless of any political leader or political party, felt that they have been separated from their co-ethnics, because they had. And much the same with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Millions of Russians were left outside the borders of what was now the Russian state, again operating on this so-called principle of nationalism for all people, nationalism for every nation. I suppose you could call it Wilsonianism if you want, where every ethnicity that has a population above 1,000 with its own unique language needs to have its own state, and we need to maintain an entire world order around these countries that could not sustain themselves under any other circumstance to keep them from being reabsorbed into larger empires or whatever other nonsense they throw at you. Again, this isn't even, I would say even 20 years ago in the West, this wouldn't be viewed as an unreasonable take. And there are many countries, I mean, even, maybe he's not the best example because he's far from a Western liberal politician, but Orban, upon the anniversary of the Trianon Treaty, said much the same thing about hundreds of thousands of Hungarians being cut off from their homeland, whether that be in Slovakia, in Romania, in Serbia, wherever. It's this very normal, natural sentiment that unless you, again, are dedicated, and a lot of these people are, to a global liberal hegemony, the fact that two Slavic nations are feuding over centuries old territorial disputes and cultural disputes, really, I don't think you can be driven to have that much of passion about it unless you are of the opinion, like I said, many of these people are, that Russia is just this existential threat to the system that must be brought down. Now, a threat by their own making at that matter, but I suppose that's aside from the point. But it's going back to that, is Putin based? Is he on our side? Or is he secretly our enemy? I mean, at the end of the day, the man is a pragmatist, and it looks like he has his golden opportunity to achieve one of the goals of the Russian nations. I'm not saying Putin's a hardcore ethnic nationalist. I do think some of his track record in terms of Russian internal policy may point to things that he's much more of, say, what you may call a civic nationalist. But again, that's not the point here. The point here is there is nothing irrational, erratic, insane about what Russia is doing right now, and anyone trying to tell you that is either drinking the Kool-Aid wholesale or is deliberately trying to fool you.
Right, and in his speech, he did mention some things that, of course, are not different, are very different than the situation, for instance, with Germany and said countries, Czechoslovakia and Poland, and that is, well, for one, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia basically paid the debt for all the Soviet republics, and it paid not only the entirety of Ukraine's debt, but a $250 billion investment that it pumped into Ukraine that it finished paying off in 2017. That is something Germany was not doing. And so when you really dig deeper into the details, you will find out that the situations are not the same at all. They're
Yes,
actually
it's the
quite different.
it's
Only,
the it's the product of, again, that liberal conception of history where
yes,
it's these very shallow, narrow understandings of these events
very.
that are just used to justify any modern things rather than acknowledging any real context to these situations.
Right, right. It's a lot like Western politicians. They're extremely shallow. They're just talking heads. And that's another important distinction is that, Putin gave this 45, almost 50-minute long speech. I watched a slightly longer version. There are different versions. There are ones that are just cut up in little pieces. But I found the one with like the translator that was least irritating to listen to, and that was like close to 58 minutes. In any case, there was no teleprompter. Uh, there was nothing pre-recorded. Uh, Absolutely the opposite of any kind of Western politician that you will see, which to me indicates that Putin has wanted to say these things for a very long time. And, you know, he was very competent. He gave everybody a very good lesson on the intricacies of the early Soviet Union. He could have even gone deeper, for instance, like I mean, he did go into a lot of detail, even distinguishing the differences, let's say, between Stalin's approach and Lenin's approach, and how on the surface they looked like they were the same, but Lenin, this is in the early days of the Soviet Union. Russia was called the prison of nations, and so for the Bolsheviks to keep their power, they had to appeal to minorities, and they had to appeal to these areas that were predominantly minority, that were not Russian, and the land was given to them basically to appease them, and no one got more of this than Ukraine. Um, Kazakhstan is another example where Kazakhs weren't even a majority; they were a minority. But this was given basically to quell potential nationalist feelings within, but also that would reinforce the power structure that was established from the Soviet um, revolution, right? And in many ways, it had to sell that because the Soviet Revolution basically destroyed the glue that did hold together more or less the Soviet, the Russian Empire, which was the Orthodox Church. It was the one thing that they were all the same on, and that was eradicated. So that even forced the issue. In some ways, I think Putin hinted at that, but not as direct. I don't believe he said it as directly as I have. But in in that time, the term Russian chauvinist was often used. Russians disproportionately made up the people, even beyond their demographic representation. They disproportionately filled the gulags. Um, we've spoken other times on how the Soviet Union created alphabets for the various people that were once part of the Russian Empire, and Mikola Skrupnik, no, yeah, Skrupnik. He was a Bolshevik who developed the Ukrainian alphabet and so on, and so there was this Ukrainization process that was happening in the 20s in Ukraine because they knew they gave land that was filled with many Russians, but in the west side with many Poles. Um, so that in a way led uh, eventually created the problems that we have now.
I mean, and
Uh,
one point I've made a lot that Putin came just shy of saying is the 1932-1933 famine, better known as the Holodomor, which has been portrayed
oh yeah,
widely as a targeted genocide and starvation of Ukrainian people. You look at the regions it affected. These areas were whether that be in eastern Ukraine, southern Russia, into northern Kazakhstan. These were areas populated by ethnic Russians. That's there's come
yeah,
to,
yeah,
like, yes, there were
yeah.
deliberate
And people
famines that,
forget Kazakhstan. Like I
yes,
have a
a
good friend
lot.
of mine who's Romanian, and he's a friend of another friend of mine. We went to some of the. I shall not mention the protests names, but he's also a friend. And anyway, so this Armenian man, his family's been in Russia for a long time, and he goes like, "You're crazy. My family went through the starvation as well." So, and I have a friend who's half Russian, half Ukrainian, who also says the same thing. So, um, I mean, that's really to, and in a sense, Biden's little 9-minute speech, you know, mentioned Ukraine like, it's Ukraine's right to exist, almost like he was talking about Israel, and except of course the U.S. largely abandoned Ukraine.
I mean, well, speaking
Uh,
speaking of Israel, I think it's worth mentioning that I saw some pretty interesting takes that apparently the Putin regime has a list of several peoples and groups that will be arrested and or liquidated upon the
uh, oh
annexation of
yes,
Ukraine, which includes a population of 200,000 Jewish Ukrainians who may be targeted. So we have to look out for them, and
yeah,
perhaps
yeah,
that's where the main concern is coming from, that very large population who
yeah.
certainly
Press
will.
X to doubt.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes. Again, it goes back to Schrodinger's Putin, isn't it? Where he's this simultaneously very civic nationalist figure who is very philo-Semitic and very supportive of Zionism, but he also has targeted lists of uh, all 200,000 Ukrainian Jewish population that he plans on doing just the horrible, most evil things to. And again, it's just in many ways when it comes to the Western mindset, and perhaps we are guilty of this, perhaps we've been guilty of this in the past. Putin is whatever or whoever you need him to be.
right, right, and like I said, we've mentioned it on the show before. There are the revision to the Russian Constitution states things that could never possibly be written in any kind of constitution in the West. It would be anathema. You could not do it. Uh, in Canada, for instance, um, as they issued the state of emergency, they had to put down, of course, that people of color, refugees, and so on could protest, right? Uh, that will never happen in Russia. And the Canadian Constitution, despite the fact that it does not privilege any historic group uh, within Canada as somehow being, the original founders and what Russia really is, and so on. Despite the fact that it doesn't mention that, Canada does feel obligated, of course, because because these people that we're talking about are the foot soldiers for liberalism in the West. Floyd Rights 2020. Um, Russia has passages and statements in there that could never ever happen in a Western country. Period. And that is a difference. Like, um, I don't know. Most people who talk about Russia have literally never been to Russia, and I don't think they like another hilarious comparison is uh, church attendance is low. Yeah, but people who go, those churches are very full. My fr-
Yeah, it's only
my fr-
6% in a country that had it more or less effectively banned for 70 years. Those are real unimpressive numbers there when you're just beginning your
yeah, I
recovery.
mean, but the question is how can America have so many Christians and they are so ineffectual, and how can Russia have so few, and how are they so effectual? That's the difference. Okay. So my first days in Moscow, what I was surprised to see was the churches ringing bells for Vespers. There was not one day I didn't see somebody enter a church, like literally not one day. Um, so I don't know what the exact numbers are, blah blah blah, but it is part of who they are, and it like I say, um, America could double the amount of Christians, and it would not move the cultural needle. Those are the facts.
Yeah, it's bitter pill to swallow, but looking at the power of, say, institutional Christianity, at least within the United States, within the Anglosphere, and most of the Western world, you get a few places where there's some exceptions. It is either ineffectual, if not completely on board. I mean, there's a reason why Episcopalians have lesbian bishops.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's ridiculous. These wasting time on this is just it should be self-explanatory. I
but
mean, you
yeah, and again, like that's not even like the whole point. Like again, like a lot of this information is irrelevant because you can point out whatever number of social ills Russia might have. It just simply doesn't justify why I'm supposed to view it as this number one geopolitical threat that threatens my very existence and way of life. Because like maybe let's take what you say at face value. Everything is true about Russia. They have all those social ills. They're not as based as they've been portrayed to be. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that still doesn't make me want to take up arms and defend the Ukraine. Which I mean, if you want to look at those numbers, if once again, if they're to be believed, are pretty consistent throughout most of the former Soviet Union when it comes to things such as abortion rates, church attendance, other views on social policies. Now, of course, there are significant differentials when it comes to very particular topics, but if you want to do like the base not base thing, it's like if Russia isn't based, Ukraine isn't based, so why should I support either? And it's not. It's this very weird metric people try to build this thing on. Like I'm supposed to care about the internal political situation of two countries, neither of which I have any ancestral, linguistic, cultural, or ethnic ties to. Now, perhaps you, with your background, could say slightly differently, but I that's again none of that's really the point of all of this now, isn't it? But it becomes the epicenter of a lot of these arguments. Not that culture and civilizational issues aren't important to these topics. This what this entire show is about, but they get into so much minutia about it that at the end of the day, it's like, What are we even
Yeah, it's
talking about
because
anymore?
it's because we're in trouble. It's because we're rudderless. I understand the frustration that, we don't have any heroes, and particularly the situation here in Canada is utterly hopeless. I mean, they're going to make some of the measures in the Emergency Measures Act permanent now. You literally can no longer provide funding to, a certain political group or protest unless the government approves it. Now just think about that, right? Um, I just I don't care about these, and the right just goes on and on and on about this, and it's like I said, the content literally derives from people reading comments, not producing content about Russia, like worshiping Russia or Putin. It's just small comments that most of the time certain normies make, like, I wish our leader was like that. And like, it sounds like it drives them up the wall.
Yeah, a lot of it is just this grass is greener effect, which I mean is very like you have a lot of Canadians saying, "Oh, I wish we had Trump," or a lot of people saying, "Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
I wish we had Zemmour, or Le Pen." It's again like you can point to all these individual problems, but a lot of it are just offhand grass is greener sort of comments. Like, yeah, sorry I didn't do a full analysis besides saying like, "Oh, hey, that's cool."
Yeah, every COVID protest that I've photographed, that I've documented, I have without exception, there are people who wear "Make America Great Again," uh, Trump won, Trump, Trump 2020, Trump 2024. Um, like, you will always find them. They are there in the crowd, right? And I understand, like, the sense of hopelessness is very real. It's very discouraging. And what's scary is that a large portion of the population is against us. The media has completely gaslit them to be against us. And all kinds of stupid gay ops, that we've already discussed on the show, that they're obviously government plans, um, because none of those plants are ever found and prosecuted. Other cases are kind of an in-between area. And you are going to have people who, they're mentally unstable, but they are stable, they're cognizant enough that they see where things are going, and they are going to do certain things that are, they're violent. And even though they don't realize there's no backing behind it, that kind of panic, that kind of despair, has been a feature, but there's never been an organized front. That's why these, what is a lone wolf attack if nothing but the result of gaslighting a targeted demographic in the West, which made the West, and them, like, losing it. That's essentially what it is. It's despair. It, anyhow, yeah, I mean, just to get back with the issue in Russia, there's been some interesting ideas, I think, that people have had, like, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Was it all a Russian gay op? Was it a mix? You know, I don't know. I can't prove it one way or another. All I know is that there was a cycle that was established for nearly 8 years where there would be shelling, and most of the shells would come, like, because Donbass doesn't have the same amount of armaments. Most of the shells would be Ukrainian, but a significant portion, close to half, would come from Donbass. And you can, if people want to get into the minutia about who's defending who, obviously one party wants to eradicate these people who are there, and if you want to look at that as a defensive action rather than an offensive action, then that's fine. But the other side isn't going to see it that way. In any case, so what always happens, in many ways, everything that has happened now, that it has been established for nearly 8 years, especially after Minsk II. That's when, a lot of the severe fighting that had happened stopped. And so you had these skirmishes, just skirmishes. And last year in April, so you had a buildup of Ukrainian forces on the border. Then the Russians start sending their forces near the Ukrainian border. This also coincides with some exercises. I'm sure some of that was pretext. NATO's doing their own exercises in Poland and in the Baltic states. And the escalation keeps mounting and mounting. Ukraine starts shelling, Donbass starts firing back, a civilian dies here, a soldier dies there. Um, and, Putin and Biden 6 weeks later are meeting, talking in Vienna. It subsides, then it starts to ramp up again. And all I'm saying is that this cycle has been going on for almost 8 years, definitely 7 years. By February of 2022, let's say 7 years. Um, and I think this time Putin did something that I don't think anyone expected to, because I don't think, in hindsight, I don't think Putin wanted more than Crimea. I think he always thought he could bargain his way without having to risk enlarging the war there. So, you know, people who say, well, by taking Crimea, he's going to lose water access by the Ukrainians. Yes, but I think if you were strategizing, you might think like, well, sure, maybe, but we're still going to give them gas and oil. Like they're still going to get good prices for it. Like 2017, they paid off their debt. We don't know what kind of things are being discussed between the two sides or just within one side that would make him think like, Crimea is the only strategic thing I want here. And I'm not prepared to like take half of Ukraine plus Odessa, right? And there was never any attempt to do so. And even when the rebels had resounding success and they took over Kharkov and uh, Slavyansk, and they were like, I remember watching the videos. These guys were saying we're going all the way to Kiev, and it was like, they'd won some very important battles in August of 2014, and so like from what I know, from the intel that I know, and the people who spoke to me who were on the ground there, Russia was literally telling them, you can't do this. You're not going to go all the way to Kiev because one, you'll be slaughtered. You're going to run out of steam. And you don't have the tactical ability to do this. And so they had to be pulled back. And then the rebels got caught up in Slavyansk, and the Russians had to sort of across the border fire in order to give them enough cover to escape out of Slavyansk before they were completely massacred, right? So there was never really any attempt by the Russians to take half of Ukraine or go all the way to Lvov. Like that was, I don't think it was ever there. And I think that's what caught everybody off guard. I think, they thought maybe Putin could go this way forever. Because I think one of Putin's ideas was that if the Donbass republics do get special status, if Minsk finally takes place, well, then maybe that'll have a ripple effect. Maybe the language laws that Ukraine almost immediately insisted upon in 91, which caused a panic even then, and is why that shortly after Crimea asked to secede, uh, is it terrified people. Like now they had these, cultural ideologues that said, we don't care if you've been living with us for centuries. You're only going to speak this language. You're not going to speak any other, and so on and so on. And so all of that was scrapped. It would be kind of like, there's an election in Canada and they say, well, to the Quebecers, you're never going to speak Quebec French again. That's it. It's over for you. Um, so deal with it. Well, I mean, it's not really like that's not a situation everyone is going to walk away from. Certainly, people will not be able to walk away from that, and there'll be others that think that that's morally reprehensible, so they will resist. So I think Putin probably bargained on that the Donbass republics would set up a kind of a precedent, and maybe that's a very hopeful scenario, a very optimistic one, but probably if it doesn't take off, well, then at least they have some status. And, I don't have to take care of these people. And, I mean, he does. But that's only because, Ukraine shut off the gas for them. They stopped paying their pensions. And this happened like a while ago. So it's not like it happened last year or the year before. In any case, I think that was the strategy, and I think that the security talk in Munich, uh, it was obvious that the Germans had made up their mind, for, probably because of American pressure, that they would suspend Nord Stream 2. And I think at that point it was over. There was no point in talking to these people. There was no point in bargaining with them. So, that's a long, so of course he's going to go in. There's no point. They're going to, as he said, they're going to sanction this anyways. And I've always said that. I've said that for years. They're always going to sanction Russia. That doesn't matter what Russia does or doesn't do. They're going to sanction them. Um, I think that this is there's going to be all kinds of repercussions from this. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next week. I think the situation is probably very fluid right now. Um, but I guess what I'll say is ultimately, I don't think Putin necessarily wanted this, and I think the fact that it took so long. Yes, I know he said I should have done this a long time ago. Yes, yeah, you should have, but here we are. You didn't, and you used them as a bargaining chip, and here we are.
I suppose that's all you can really say about this, and it is still a rather fresh occurrence. Now, I wanted to make this episode today because we're recording. It's the night of February 2nd, 2022, also known as 2222, which is that very esoteric date people were predicting a lot of things would happen on, and it came actually just hours before 2222 actually came to pass in at least the Western Russian time zone, say Moscow. But it looks like there were some pretty big events of today, and it looks like more is to come. And we can only say so much because, again, these things have just happened within the past 48 hours, so there's only, again, we can only say so much without going into the territory of speculation. But if you have anything else for the show, I suppose we could cover that. If not, I guess we could bring it to a close.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything. I mean, Argent, that I listen to sometimes. He's a YouTube channel. You guys probably know him. He had some theories about, like, you know, was this a gay? And I thought that was quite neutral and provocative.
Yeah,
But
it covered pretty much all the bases, went over all the common theories, and from, again, more of like, hey, this could be possible. And again, I'm also a frequent watcher, and I know that many of you are here because I shill in his stuff all the time. So if that's the case,
yeah,
welcome to all of
I,
you in
I I just think
particular.
that there was a cycle that was already in place for 7 years, and ultimately this is going to be about keeping Germany and Europe down. Prices, I said it last week, but prices are going to soar. Jen Psaki even said so herself, that yes, prices, the likelihood of prices soaring in the US will be is very possible. And I mean, in some ways, um, especially after COVID, especially with all the economic difficulties that COVID restrictions have brought about. This is going to prolong the economic recovery of the US and of Europe. And it's like, I don't know how long America can keep this up.
I'm glad
Like,
you brought that up because, as we've been covering over the past few weeks, it does seem a bit more evident the reason why they shelved the Convid narrative in preparation for this. Because I think if they would have combined these two, it would not have been pretty. Now, I'm not
yeah.
saying it would have been like full revolution. That, of course, the based powers that all the QAnon predictions would come true. Not nothing like that. But I do think you'd see things like the trucker protests on a much larger scale across the West, and just general discontentment, and that they could only play their cards a certain way without, again, overplaying their hand. And trying to juggle these two narratives at once, I think, was just not in the realm of possibility for them, as much as I think they would have liked to.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I just think like, we talk a lot about, for instance, for us, for our movement, not, just how morally crushing it is and how frustrating it is to mount anything back. And we are forced to um, ride the tiger. Um, the question is, how much longer can Europe ride the tiger? How much longer can Germany ride the tiger? Because ultimately, what Germany is doing is it's not just losing like its economic freedom, it is also losing its cultural freedom and going along. Because eventually a country that is more economically independent will over time also be more culturally independent. Um, a lot of what like Germany is asked to do, a lot of that is of course part of the whole stupid denazification process. And a lot of it is just like any other country that's dominated by the West. The elites mimic whatever the Americans are saying. It's you have to look at it as a kind of a cycle. And so what happens in America will ripple into Canada 2 years later, into the UK about 2 years later, then maybe it's the Scandinavian countries 4 or 5 years later, and it will just take off. Now there is some sort of reverse flow that happens where you have intellectuals and various people in powerful positions, intellectuals, politicians who will understand where the messaging is leading to, and then will accelerate it. That happens as well. But the original force is coming from the states because that I mean they have the military and the economic power to do so. And I just think like if Germany is capable of pushing back, because and it won't be just Germany, this will affect all of Europe, right? Like Nord Stream 2 was signed on, including the UK. It was not like Boris Johnson makes it sound like they never had anything to do with it, especially after Brexit. But the fact is the UK signed on, and so did Italy, so did France, Germany, Russia. There are other players as well who signed on, right? And basically like America has had to rein them in. When Biden says he's back, he means like, you plebs shut up. You're going to have to behave yourself. And I think that's why the UK goes out of its way to try to impress the Biden administration. He's really trying to impress like America that he's going along, that he knows the program, right? Essentially, that's what it's about.
And I think, insofar as this topic is concerned, we've said all we can say within
Yes.
the information that we have. So I know we've been cranking out a lot of episodes. We're on episode 199. This would have been a fitting 200th episode, but I suppose, things aren't always meant to be. But we will be back this weekend with episode 200 of the War Report. So we're eager to see you all for
Woo.
that. And thank you for your time. And thank you for choosing to listen to this hour of the War Report. It's a shorter episode. I keep the
Yeah,
and to think the hour would be the short episode. I suppose that happens to everyone who
yeah.
starts sort of operation. They struggle to get that 1 hour mark, and then they struggle to stay below that 2 hour mark, which is where I try to keep the show. I try to keep about an hour and a half. You guys seem to like it, so Thank you all very much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Take care, guys.